I'm Stan Altman, the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, so let me welcome you to the fourth, and in some ways, unfortunately, the last lecture in a series of 4 lectures that Peter Vallone has been giving on government and politics. Tonight's topic is about government and the whole budget process, which is always an issue of great importance. As most people will tell you, if you really want to understand what government's priorities are, you just take a look at what's funded. And so you learn a lot about what actually goes on during the course of the budget process. And since money is necessary to make programs happen, a lot of the political process that takes the give and take to try to reconcile differences of policies and priorities get reconciled in that process. And I'm sure we're going to have an interesting set of insights into the whole budget process, both in the city and probably in the state as well, from Peter tonight. Given that tonight is our last in this series, I want to take a moment to thank a number of individuals and organizations that made this entire series possible. These are individuals who essentially donated the funds to create an endowment that has made this lecture series possible, and that is the May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, the Delaware Bay Corporation from T.K. Duggan, the Marshall Rose Family Foundation, Lawrence Gaslow's Empire Office, Inc., Judy and Fred Wilpon's Family Foundation, William D. Frigese, and George F. Kaufman from Kaufman Management. And again, as it has been on 3 other earlier occasions, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Peter Vallone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. There will be prizes awarded at the end of this particular lecture for anyone who can repeat back some of the salient elements of what we've done in the last 3 times. But we have some very special people with us tonight. First of all, sitting right where he always was, next to me in the city council, and now he kind of runs the whole thing. He's the guy you have to see if you want to get married in the city of New York. And that's a non-controversial subject, that's why I brought it up. But our city clerk, Victor Robles. Thank you, Victor, for being here. And also seated right here in front, this is a very shy woman. She was very shy in government and never raised her voice in any manner, shape, or form. A former very dynamic Deputy Mayor Fran Ryder. Fran, thank you for being here too. And a gentleman who's no stranger to CUNY and a longtime good friend and former member of the Campaign Finance Board, which administers the monies we talked about, Marty Begun. Marty, thank you very, very much for being here. We also have a young woman who's also seated at this very same table, who's been involved with just about every civic endeavor that was ever good for the city of New York for at least a few years. Sally Goodgold. Sally, thank you also for coming. And we have the general counsel for the city council, to make sure I don't deviate too far from what actually goes on in the city council, Tom McMahon. Thank you, Tom. And we have, not last, but almost last, and she's first in terms of the budget that we're talking about tonight. She is the budget director for the City Council of the City of New York, Larian Angelo. Larian, thank you very, very much for being here. There's going to be some tough questions for you later, Larian. And also, last but not least, a former colleague of mine who did the great thing of bringing about 12 or 13 of his students with him along tonight. Great chairperson of the City Council, a great council member, and now a teacher at CUNY, Steve DiBrianza. Steve, thank you for bringing your students along. We'll make some other introductions as we go along, but what I would like to do tonight, since it's the last of this particular series, not the last that's going to occur, we'll have a first starting up again, hopefully in the fall. But what I'd like to do is just a quick review of what we talked about, and then go into this mammoth budget whole situation and how it sets policy and some of the laws that we passed in the city of New York. So you recall that the very first thing we talked about was the balance of power and how important it is, and how important it is to find a system that actually works in government. And this is nothing new to civilizations of any kind. As a matter of fact, the first known person who spoke about it was 3,000 years ago, the prophet Micah, when the people tried to figure out what does God require of us. And as you know, what the prophet Micah said was, all that God requires of you is to do the right thing. And the problem has been for all these thousands of years is, what is the right thing to do? Now, as close as you can come to the right thing to do, as near as I know, is what happened about 250 years ago with the Declaration of Independence. That is the roadmap. That is the secret. That is what the foundation is to the government that we are privileged to be part of today. And all it was one of the greatest, outlines that I've ever read. And I tell my students, or if there's anything you ever memorize in life, do that. Memorize the Declaration of Independence. That's where it starts off very clearly. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that we are all created equal. That means nobody's any better than anybody else. That means, where do you get room for discrimination? That's ridiculous if we're all created equal. In any event, then it goes on to say that we are endowed by our Creator, not by government, not by a president, not by the council, not by a mayor. We are endowed by a higher authority with the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to the pursuit of happiness. That means no one can take it away from you. And then it goes on to say that governments are instituted to make sure you have those rights. It has to be with your consent. So all of the principles of government are right there. And the Constitution is based upon that document. The Articles of Confederation didn't work because it's too loose. And they had that ridiculous thing called term limits in it. And they knew that it didn't work. And they got rid of it. And we're still having problems today with some people who think that that's the best way to change government. Throw everybody out. It's like saying to CUNY, well, let's throw every teacher out, throw every professor out. I'm sure there's people out there that could do a better job, but what a stupid thing to do. And the effects of that are going to take many, many years before people realize that's the wrong way to improve government, to throw everybody out at the same time. Just doesn't work, all right? But if you asked 8 out of 10 people on the street, are you in favor of term limits? They would say yes, because they all know somebody, I do too, that I can't stand in government. and you figure that's the only way you get rid of him or her. But you don't throw everybody out, and that's what the problem with term limits is. So we talked about that, and we talked about campaign finance, which Marty Begun administered, which gives an equal playing field, saying that by the government supplying money to candidates who show that they have the support of the people, we will match your funds 4-to-1. So if somebody's willing to give me $10, dig down if you can, friend. $10, that becomes $50 but with the campaign finance, which means that the little person with the little donation can, with a lot of people, equal the big person who says, I have so much money, I don't need anybody else. That's okay too, but the problem is you need to be able to get the average person into government. And the only way you can do that is with campaign finance. And then we went on from that to talk about good government against good politics. There's a huge difference. Politics is the vehicle for you to get into government. But when you get into government, you're supposed to forget politics and do the right thing for all of the people, no matter what their registration is, whether they're registered or not. That's your job. And it works pretty good. But one place where it doesn't work at all, and which we should all be ashamed of, is what goes on in Albany. That's totally nuts. What it does, instead of good government being the end of what's going on in Albany, it's good politics. And they just reversed it. And the best example, the most striking example of what has happened to Albany is what they did to the city of New York a couple of months before September 11th, when we had balanced the budget and we had $1 billion surplus and we were planning all kinds of things for the city. One little election in the state of New York, in Rockland County, which most people don't even visit from the city of New York. It's a nice place, I've been there. But one little election where the Republican candidate says, you know what? I'm against the commuter tax, which is not a tax at all. It's a commuter use fee for people who work in the city of New York, take our services in the city of New York, pay nothing for it. And it's costing less than the price of half a token, and it's $600 million a year in the city's budget. Recurring revenue. Okay? So the Republican candidate says it. Nobody pays attention because that's politics. Nobody likes to pay a tax. Do away with all taxes, and you might as well do away with government because there's no way you can run. Right? Okay. Democratic candidate says, well, I can't let him get away with that, so I'm saying the same thing. Still nobody cares. But then, because they were worried about the Republican control of the Senate, and the Democrats in the Assembly says, hey, we might be able to take control back away from politics, Joe Bruno, the majority leader of the Senate, he passes it. Unheard of. But still, you need 2 houses. You need 2 people to dance. You need 2 houses to pass something in the state legislature. So myself and Mayor Giuliani, different parties, ran up to Albany and said, Joe, what are you, nuts? You can't take $600 million out. Don't worry. The Democrats in the Assembly will never pass it. So we go to the Assembly. This is politics. We can't let them get away with that. Go to the governor. He'll never sign it. Oh, sure, he'll never sign it. They pass it. It's a 2-house bill, and the governor says, what, me? Be in favor of a tax? Governor, this is not a tax. Wherever there's an income tax in the entire country, they charge the commuters the same rate, higher, much higher than the city of New York pays. This is only a pittance. They sign it, $600 million out of our budget. We have a disaster, September 11th, horror that's unparalleled in all of recorded history. Thousands of people killed in one fell swoop. Hundreds of thousands of jobs gone. Do you think that maybe they would give us back the $600 million? No. Politics. Because the governor is running, a new mayor, term limits, everybody knew. New mayor comes in and said, obviously the governor is going to help. They're very nice guys. I had them over for dinner. They're wonderful people. The head of the state, the head of the assembly, this is terrific. They'll help. They promised they would help. Do you know what they did? Zip. Not one single penny to help the city of New York. Best example of politics over good government ever. And it has to be changed. People have to hold their state legislators accountable. People have to get the leadership up in Albany to wake up and say, you can't do that to the greatest city in the world. I don't want to get too excited about it, but that was one of the lectures that if you were here, you saw how upside down Albany is at the moment, and it has to change. And then we went into the power of the media. How does the media affect government? And that's a very easy one because, as you know, if the prophet Micah said correctly that all God requires of you is to do the right thing, then just as correctly, if you want to get onto the first page of any newspaper or on television that night, and if there was a prophet of the media, that prophet would tell you, all you got to do is the wrong thing. And you definitely will get onto page 1 or onto national television or on, and that's unfortunately the way it has to be because they're businesses. They have to make money. And I use the quotation from Jim Jensen, who came to speak at the large Astoria Civic Association some years ago, many members of which are here now, in which people said, why is it only bad news? Why is it that when we turn to the papers, all we see is the murder, the most vicious murder that we've ever seen that occurred in the city, and if it didn't occur in a city in New Jersey or Connecticut or whatever the closest place is, or maybe in India, whatever the most horrible thing that has happened, that is going to be the main story. Nothing about what's happening right. Nothing about all the good things that happen. Nothing about all the good things in government that are happening. Just what's going wrong. And they said, Jim Jensen said to this whole audience like this, it's your fault. You're only interested in the cat caught up in the tree, not the thousands that are on the ground. That's what sells newspapers. So you got to have that kind, you have to now figure out how, if you want to run for office, how do you get some good press? How do you get some press without having to do something wrong? Because most people don't want to do anything wrong. They want to do something right. And there are ways of doing that. And the best example I could show was I worked for 7 years on the administrative code, trying to revise the administrative code, one of the biggest tasks and most important tasks ever when I first got into the council some years ago. And I walked into room 9, which is the press room, which is where all the press are gathered. And right at that time, they used to share the conference room that council members shared. And I had all these books, and I put the books down, and 2 marvelous people from the media. Doug Edelson, who was the voice of WINS radio, and Steve Flanders, who was the voice of CBS Radio, the two largest radio stations in the world. Millions of people listen. They see me with all these books, and they come over and they said, and I was just a Cub council member. I might have been there for maybe 2 or 3 months. And they said, what is all that stuff? Because we have a slow day, key words. Slow day, no murders or horrors occurring. And they're trying to get some news to fill some space. And I start going into a long explanation of the problems of the administrative code. And after the first 2 minutes, they say, stop, 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 stop. If you want to get on a radio, you got to do it in 15 seconds or less. It's got to be something interesting. I said, well, this is not interesting. Maybe someday it will be. Don't you have anything else? And I had one paper in my hand. I represent a little place called Astoria in Queens, and there was a house of prostitution that the police couldn't close because the law only allowed them to close these kind of nefarious activities if there was multiple dwellings. And all I did was to take one word out of the law, multiple, so that all dwellings were covered if used for narcotics or prostitution or anything of that nature. They went nuts. And I was on the press, before I knew it, I was on two radio stations. The NYC television comes over. Other television stations find out what's this activity about. And all of a sudden, I was a hero because I was trying to end prostitution in the world because I was taking one of these words out. My aunt in Florida saw me on television. You know, this one little thing, because it had some kind of a sales item to it. The media wants, sells what is interesting to the people. And it became interesting. And so that's one way of doing it, doing something good, which has an angle to it, which can get somebody at the press interested. And the other way, obviously, is to buy commercials. You heard from Peg Breen, one of the greatest communicators in the world, who says, if you could afford it, people actually are influenced by commercials. So if you want to run for mayor, you want to run for governor, if you want to run for a higher office, you have to be able to get money to get onto television, which is the most important media, and then radio comes secondarily. And that's where campaign finance comes in, which brings us finally to today, because what I want to do to today is to speak for about 15 minutes and leave time for Gary Altman, who's going to correct many of the mistakes I make tonight for 5 minutes, and most importantly, Larry Angelo, who's going to very simply explain the 4th largest budget in the world. And she can do the only person I know that can do it that quickly. But the budget of the city of New York is $44.5 billion, just the expense budget, as I speak to you now. And there's a difference between the expense budget, which pays for salaries and services, as Steve will tell you, and the capital budget, which pays for this institution and building schools and building anything, bridges and anything that's permanent structures comes under the capital budget. That's another $7 or $8 billion. The only budgets in this country that are bigger, and pretty much throughout the world, is the whole government of the United States of America, the whole state of California, and the whole state of New York. That's how big the budget is of the city of New York. And that's the biggest law that the city council passes. And the way a budget works is pretty much under that balance of powers that we talked about under the Constitution, where you have 3 branches of government, the executive, legislative, and judicial, and the executive branch, either the president or the governor, and in this case, the most important mayor in the world, the city of New York. The mayor proposes the budget. The mayor proposed this $44.5 billion budget to the city council, or the president to Congress. Now, once the city council or the Congress gets it, it can amend the budget. It can change the budget. Not much of it, because most of it, 95% of it, as Larry will tell you, is salaries, police, fire, sanitation. So there's not $44.5 billion that you can move around, but there might be something in the area of about $1 billion, which is still no small change, that you can move around to affect policy. And I have certain examples before we get to the actual breakdown of the budget itself, which incidentally comes this way. 70% of the budget comes from local taxes. Okay, that's the real estate tax and the personal income tax and the business tax of that $44.5 billion. Right? 20% of it comes from money back from the state of New York. But the state of New York gives us $3.5 billion less back than we give them. And the other 10% comes from the federal government giving back some of our own money. But that's $6 billion less than we give the federal government. That's the general breakdown of where we get the money from. Of that dollar, if you want to use 100 cents of the budget, of the $44.5 billion, 31 cents goes just to education. 31 cents out of the $1. The next 21 cents goes to social services or human resources. So more than half the budget goes to just two things: education and social services. Then police, fire, sanitation, and all the other things come in there. So if you want to affect a change of policy after the mayor introduces a budget, how do you do it? Well, I'm going to give you some quick examples of how the city council did it and still does do it. And it's the same thing with Congress, but I can speak relatively correctly about what goes on in the city council, and I'm not too sure sometimes about what goes on in the state or the federal government. But in any event, what we're talking about here, back in 1986, you'll recall that you could hardly walk any place in the city of New York without stepping over a homeless person. That was really an outrage. And the policy of the city of New York, and of the country pretty much at the time, was, let's make it as bad as possible and they'll go away. Don't make things too good for suffering people on the street, because if you do, more will come. As a matter of fact, at that time, states like Florida were actually giving money to homeless people to come to New York City, telling them that you get better off in New York City. It was a terrible situation. Advocates for the homeless and the Legal Aid Society at the time had this distorted idea that leave them there. You can't touch them. It's unconstitutional to touch them. They have a right to be on the streets. Figuring that this would so shock the people that they would do something about it. It was a terrible situation. So what we did, because before you can pass a law in the city of New York, it has to go through a committee. We formed a Homeless Assistance Committee, and we said, let's stop the nonsense. Let's get the advocates at the same table, with the legislative leaders that might make a difference, with the real estate industry, who's very much interested in making sure that the city looks better than it looked at the time, and see what we can do about it. And you know what we found out? We then found out that the more you could do for the homeless, the less likely that they're going to remain on the streets. So working with the then mayor, Mayor Koch, who was an enlightened mayor, we started to do different things. One was we passed local law 46 of 1987, which said, let's take an inventory. The state, once again, there were places like Willowbrook, which some of you might recall, said this is a terrible situation where we're keeping these mentally disturbed people, and some of them are not mentally disturbed, in terrible institutions. So let's mainstream them back into society. Fine, but they didn't pay for it. So they released the people from their mental institutions, and they wound up on the streets of the city of New York and other cities, Rochester, wherever, through cities throughout the state of New York. So we were doubly faced with this problem. And we passed the law and said, number one, let's get an inventory. Number two, let's find out who's on the streets and why are they on the streets. If they're mentally incompetent, then let's try and help them. Maybe they just need a home. Let's try and find a place for them. And let's get a transitional way of not only counting the homeless, but finding out how we can get them what? A home. So we started a whole process which changed the direction the city was going in. And is it perfect? No. But it's a heck of a lot better than it was. And it has budgetary implications. And in this case, the budgetary implications were favorable, because what the city was doing was putting homeless people who they could find and wanted to in hotels, which were costing $3,000 or $4,000 a month. Steve Vienza is shaking his head because he was chairperson of the committee during that time that was trying to get the administration to wake up and understand it's a lot cheaper to put a person into a home than it is to pay $4,000 a month in a hotel. So let's figure out what the problem is. And then we got Mayor Koch to say that when it gets below freezing, we have a right to pick them up off the streets and bring them to a place for help. And then we were challenged by, I don't know if any of you remember the case of Billy Boggs, where this poor woman was living in her own excrement and cursing and throwing stuff at different people. And the Legal Aid Society said, no, they have a right to be, she has a right to be here. And you know what? We're going to show you you're all wrong, because all we have to do is pick her up, dress her up, get her a condominium, and she spoke at Harvard to give a lecture. You see, Vallone, Koch, that's all you had to do. 2 weeks later, she disappeared. So far as I know, never to be found again. That doesn't work. Okay? You need care, you need help. You have to find out what the problem is. Anyway, it has budgetary implications. In this case, the budgetary implications are favorable because it costs less to try and find transitional ways of helping people back into a home than it is to put them up into a hotel. That's one example. The campaign finance you know all about. That changed the landscape of running for office in the city of New York. You have Mayor Bloomberg, who has a right to spend $1 billion for his re-election. Fine. No, I wish I had $1 billion to spend. I might have been your governor. Who knows? But $1 billion is wonderful. $100 million he spent, I think, on the election. But how do you fight that? Under campaign finance, I was privileged to be able to run, as well as 3 or 4 other Democrats, and the Democrat who eventually won the Democratic primary, a fellow by the name of Mark Green, only lost to Bloomberg by a few thousand votes. Very small, one of the smallest elections, margins of victory ever. And he just abided by, as we all did, campaign finance, which although we didn't spend $100 million, because of the money we were able to raise, we spent something over $10 million, which gave us a fair shake on television. On top of which, if you go into campaign finance, you usually get editorial support and you get free media, which is very important in terms of trying to fight somebody who could buy all the television time if he chose to. So campaign finance, and it was a great example of it working. Then we had the 1989, we had the Indoor Clean Air Act, which for the first time said you don't have to breathe somebody else's smoke and maybe you can live a few years longer. And that went up until 1995, the Smoke-Free Air Act, which said even in places like Yankee Stadium and Shea Stadium, you don't have to breathe anybody else's smoke. So that was a beginning of change in policy. It has budgetary implications. Yeah, everything has budgetary implications. But we'll get into more of that in one other second. Then we had 2 things which I think were very, very important, just to show you the power, the purchasing power of the city of New York. 1985, Local Law 19, purchase of city goods from South Africa. You remember that in 1985, Nelson Mandela was in jail. Apartheid was defended and accepted in South Africa as the proper way to have a government. Obviously, we rejected that, and we searched our mind, what can we do about this? Well, we figured out what we could do about it. You know, the Board of Education alone, the largest public school system that we know of anywhere, the city of New York, was buying parts of its lunch every day from South Africa. Every single day. 1 million lunches. They were buying parts of it. I forget what it was, whether it was some staple, fruits or whatever it was. But that was one of the things that the city of New York was doing. So we said, unless steps were taken, New York City would divest and no longer purchase from South Africa. We even put in the bill words like that the morally repugnant practice until the morally repugnant practice of apartheid ends. That was a nice step in the right direction, and it went all throughout the country, forcing the United States Congress to do it, and eventually leading to the freedom and the end, the freedom of Nelson and the end of apartheid in South Africa. One other very important one was in 1997. This was never passed into a local law. We just introduced it. Restricting deposits of funds in Swiss banks. You might recall at the time that we suddenly found out that no money was ever given from the Swiss banks to the survivors and the heirs of the survivors who deposited hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars during the Nazi persecution. Not a penny was ever paid. They wanted death certificates and things. I mean, death certificates. You know what happened, and you know how impossible it was to have the kind of proof. But there are other ways of proving it, because there were lists kept by the Nazis, very detailed. They were very detailed people. So in any event, here comes the chairman of the Finance Committee, David Weprin. Thank you, David, for being here, because we may need to ask you for a couple of $1 million before this is over, so sit down and relax. So I introduced a bill saying, because I checked with Alan Hevesy, who was the then controller, do you know how much money we deposited in Swiss banks every single day? Because we were required at the time to get the highest interest on monies that the city of New York collects tax monies, all kinds of money, and then it spends it. But before it spends it, it has to keep it, it has to earn interest on it. And the highest interest was being paid by Swiss banks. We were giving to one bank $200 million a day from our budget, a Swiss bank. So what did the intro say? We would no longer deposit monies into Swiss banks unless they began the process of paying back the victims of the Holocaust. Within 48 hours, in the Speaker's office in the City Council, the three heads of the Swiss banks were present, together with the head of the Swiss Parliament, saying, we have $60 million that we are going to start a fund. Now, $60 million was like 60 cents in comparison to the amount of money that we were talking about, but it was a beginning. Senator D'Amato, who was leading the fight, came to testify in the City Council. And that fund became a multi-billion-dollar fund, which may not be, there's no amount of money that could ever repay those victims or the victims of September 11th. But it's the only thing you can do, at least to try to do the right thing. Now, in terms of education, how does the city of New York influence education, which is controlled by the state of New York? And one of the ways we did it with the city was an enlightened chancellor by the name of Frank Macchiarola became a chancellor back in the early 80s. I was still not speaker, but I was budget representative for Queens County. And here's what he said to the council. Look, yeah, we're controlled by the state, but if you give us X amount of dollars, we will put it into a certain financial module, which Larry will explain what that is, so it can be used for no other purpose. So if you give us $3 million, we will install security in all of the schools in the city of New York. Now, that was a big problem, no security. So we would put money in for security. If you give us X amount of dollars, we will reinstitute kindergarten in the city for no other purpose. If you give us X amount of dollars, we will start reducing class size in the city. So the city now, the city council and the mayor started, up until this time, incidentally, the chairman of the city education committee and the city council never held a hearing because he said there's nothing we could do about it. But financially, we could do something about it. And we started to influence education. The biggest influence whatsoever probably was, in terms of education, was when Mayor Giuliani, just very recently in 1998, wanted to take $1.2 billion and move Yankee Stadium from the Bronx to Manhattan. Some of you may recall that situation. Well, the city council said, Mr. Mayor, no, there's an awful lot of things you have to do, even assuming we were in favor of it, which we're not in favor of because the Bronx County is the most improved county in the nation. But even assuming we're in favor of it, how are you going to move the people around? You have to make all kinds of arrangements to extend subways and get buses and all that kind of stuff. Well, he got so angry, he walked out of the budget process because that was a very high priority with him. As you can see today, they're talking about a stadium, but it's not just talking about a stadium, it's in conjunction with the Olympics, it's in conjunction, you're not talking about a baseball team that plays 88 games, you're talking about a football team that plays 8 games at home, and you're also talking about extending subways. So there's a lot of other things, even though people may not be in favor of, but that did not exist in 1998. So he walked out of budget. 2 things happened. We took the money, or we put in education. That's number one. And for instance, one of the results of that is the Frank Sinatra School that was built in Queens County, but it caters to all of the students in the city of New York. 1 new school in each borough, new textbooks, $50 million for new textbooks. I remember holding up a textbook that I used in PS122 that still was being used in public schools. I held up a 1963 history book that was still being used in 1998. So we did a lot of things, and then there was a big test for the city council, which was very, very important, because for the first time the city council adopted its own budget. Remember I told you that the mayor has to propose a budget? Well, he obviously walked out. And so the council now had to do our own budget. And it was a tremendous task. No one said that they could do it. It's thousands of pages, 44 and a half, at that time was about $40 billion. And they did a tremendous job. We adopted our own budget. Eventually, there were compromises on it because there's always a balance of power. What the mayor simply did to do, he used his executive power, didn't spend the money. So we had to wind up suing. But under our Constitution, under our system, balance works. But the important part of the balance here was the legislative body for the first time showed the executive branch, hey, you can't fool around like that. You can't just say a highway or no way. You have to be able to compromise. And the biggest thing of all that we did, before I turn it over to Gary, was Safe Street, Safe City. Safe Street, Safe City was a result of a problem that existed in the city of New York. A fellow by the name of Brian Watkins was slaughtered on a subway, trying to defend his family from a roving gang. It was horrible. And he was killed. Our cops were down to something like 20,000 from 40,000. It was pretty much a lawless city. Social services were terrible at the time as well. So what we did do was we said to the mayor, if you don't do it, we're passing a law to immediately hire 5,000 more police. How are you going to pay for that? We're going to go up to the state and we're going to ask for a earmarked tax, and we're going to raise our real estate tax a little bit more. Do you realize that the problems with social services? Yes, we do, but there's no city. Nobody will stay here unless you can make the city safe. Safety is number one, or there's nobody be left. Okay? No business will stay in the city of New York. Nobody will ride the subways anymore. So we compromised, we went up to the state, we earmarked a specific tax for that purpose, and as you know today, New York City is the safest large city that we know of anywhere. Tremendous budget implications, but we did it. Now, you can hear from some people who want to fill in some of the gaps, and then I'm going to open up for questions, starting off with Gary Altman. Gary Altman is still one of the most valuable people in the city council. He was there when I was there. He was there when Mayor LaGuardia was there. He looks a lot, he's a lot older than he looks, but he's terrific. Gary Altman, come on, Gary. Oh, I forgot to introduce Barbara Pfeiffer. I'm so sorry. Barbara, where are you? Oh, you were hiding behind a camera.
Former who was partnered with you in building up the police.
That's right. We're going to come to that in a minute. But that's Barbara Pfeiffer, who was deputy mayor to David Dinkins, without whom we would not have Safe Street, Safe City. So I'm sorry, Barbara, but you were hiding behind a camera. I couldn't, All right, Gary, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else I forgot, Gary, while you're
No,
up there?
that's it for now. You got David. The way the budget process works now, Larry will go into it, is that the mayor proposes a preliminary budget in January, sometimes February. The council then holds hearings for a period of 3 weeks. We then issue a response, which is coming out in the next few days, and then the mayor has approximately a month to issue his proposed executive budget. So he sort of gets 2 shots at the budget. Hopefully he takes into account some of our concerns when he does the proposed executive budget in April. And then about a 6-week, if we're on time, process takes place, under which we have agency hearings again over every agency, and we are supposed to come to a budget agreement by June 5th. We don't always make the June 5th date, but one thing we've never been late in terms of the fiscal year, which starts July 1st. I think only one year we've wound up June 30th, but most years we're actually early enough that the tax bills can go out because people are happy receiving their tax bills early, receiving their bills. But in one of the early elections, we talked about the balance of power, and that involved the Board of Estimate. Before there was a Board of Estimate, when there was a Board of Estimate, the council shared many powers with the Board of Estimate. I just wanted to give you a little bit of what it was like. Actually, only the second time wearing glasses, and I can I can see and I can't see. Wait.
It happens to all of us, guys.
Okay. Well, you told me how old I was, so I put on the glasses. Before the council was given the sole role in adopting the city's budget, it shared that role with the now defunct Board of Estimate. Generally, this was a chaotic time, the budget time. The mayor would propose the budget, and the goal of the council and the Board of Estimate, on which the mayor had 2 of the 11 votes, so he had a good say on the Board of Estimate, even though he already proposed the budget. The goal of the mayor and Board of Estimate, of the council and the Board of Estimate, was to get as much money as possible added back into the budget. Back then, there wasn't the careful line-by-line analysis of the mayor's proposed budget, as we see now from, and we have 2 of our budget directors here, Larry and Tom McMahon, and our other budget directors were, Peter had with Hayden Mahalsis, who's now the head of intergovernmental relations for the mayor, and his first budget director was Mark Shaw, who's now Mayor Bloomberg's first deputy mayor. So he's had a very stellar cast of budget directors. But now our staff looks line by line at the budget. Where can we find a few dollars? Where is there some waste? Where is there money that perhaps the mayor can't use? And we're going to try and take that money, convince him to take out that budget line and to use it for other things. But back then, there wasn't that much careful analysis, and basically, what would happen would be the Board of Estimate would come up of a list of their wish list of where can they add money, what do they want to add, and they would often have a list of perhaps $800, $900 million that they wanted to add. Well, then the council would come up with a list, and we had a list of $700-800 million, but we didn't work together. So if you take the 2 lists, very little overlapped. So we're talking about $1 billion or more of what we wanted to add onto the budget, and we still didn't know what was the mayor going to even give us to say, here's what I'm going to give you for your add-ons. And some years that number was as low as 20-something million dollars. In a good year, it could be 70, 80, 100, 100, I think went up as high as the low 100s one year. But we had this list of over $1 billion, and we had to work with the Board of Estimate to whittle it down to that amount, which we often didn't know until later in the process. When the Board of Estimate and the council didn't always meet on these things, because when we would go to meet with them, we would often hear that they went out to dinner. They're gone for several hours. They would come back around midnight, and by that time, perhaps the council members got tired and went home for the night. So this process would go on, and so it wasn't until the whole process ended with the Board of Estimate that now we had the sole role in this, and we were able to we had enough trouble coming to an agreement, but at least it wasn't, this 3-way kind of fight. But even now, and then, council members and the Board of Estimate, you would argue passionately for the causes that you wanted to add on to the budget. Everyone had their own either pet projects or necessary or needed projects. So while these lists are getting whittled down, perhaps there was a fight over whether tree pruning, which was a very big issue in the outer boroughs, should we cut tree pruning from $3 million on our list to $2.8 million? And there would be arguments. We can't cut it to 2.8. The trees won't get pruned. They're going to hit my power line. They're going to fall on my house. Well, actually, tree pruning was lucky that it only cut to 2.8, because when the process ended, tree pruning would be lucky to be on the list at $200,000-$300,000, while other programs that were on the list were totally off the list. So, you would argue when you don't want to drop from 5 to 4, but you were lucky at the end of the day just not to be removed from that list that our finance directors had, and sometimes those lists would, on the recreation of the list, the next day, things would come in and things would come off. Now, every year every mayor cuts programs which he knows that the council has to restore. That's money for libraries. Routinely, you'll go into the library this time of year, they'll write a letter to the mayor and the council. We need money for books. They all have signs now, shorter hours. Every year, for libraries, for cultural institutions, for recycling, education, routinely cut. Even, which we talked about last time, or 2 times ago, the Valone Scholarship, which says any student in a New York City high school, public or parochial, who maintains a B average, we will pay half of their tuition if they go to a CUNY college. Even that program, virtually every year, and now we've named it after Peter Valone, so we think it would be safer, the mayor cuts it.
That was a mistake.
It just gets cut. Tens of thousands of students have received the scholarship. It's cut. We have to put it back. So I always wonder, why does a mayor cut these programs that he knows we're putting back libraries, we're putting back Valone Scholarship? I'm guessing, to me, it's that it keeps the council busy. During that budget negotiating time, we're going to be arguing to get back the money for those things we really care about. Maybe we won't have a lot of money left over for those programs that he really doesn't want us to be thinking about. Many years ago, Peter sent a few council members to Russia to help get some refuseniks out. It was 1987. It was still communism, but Gorbachev was in power. And and I met a cousin who was still stuck there. And it was a very, very long line to get into a museum, which was free. So why should there be any line? So I asked my cousin, who I just met for the first time that morning. She came from Leningrad. We were in Moscow. And the line wound up being just to check your coat. And it was 0 degrees. It's Moscow in late November. The line's down the block. And she said, because they want you never to have time here to be able to think. You know, all you're thinking about is how cold you are on this line. I can't wait to get in. So sometimes I wonder if whether this budget process is the same way, that we focus so much on what we must restore, we don't have that much time to, get to some of these other things for the program. But when the budget is finally settled, what happens? We do a handshake with the mayor. We restore libraries. We restore culturals. And there the mayor, whoever he is standing right there with the council as if he wasn't the one who cut the program in the first place. And the next day in the paper, he's getting most of the credit for saving all these things that if Peter, if Gifford Miller now, if David Weprin, the council members didn't put back, would be out. So the whole process is a little skewed. What we try and do now, and Peter alluded to it, was we often try now to put money into economic development kind of programs where the money put in now could hopefully bring back more revenue later on. You know, put a little in now, get back more. Now, in terms of taxes, some people have heard stories about taxes. There are only 2 taxes that the city can impose without having state approval that can go into our budget. One is the property tax, which last year we had to raise, but generally we try to avoid that, and now we're actually seeking to reduce that increase. And the other one is a almost extinct tax called the commercial rent tax, which is very rare to New York City. It's a tax you pay a tax on the right to rent your store. No other city has it. You're already paying rent to the landlord. You're paying other taxes on your sales, and this is a tax on that. And we've eliminated over the years. We've knocked it down in almost all the boroughs. It now only exists to a small percentage of business owners in New York City. And the other thing... Manhattan, below 96th Street. In terms of what's in the budget, there's 2 interesting things in the budget also, is that there are 2 agencies in the city, well, I'm going to call it council and agency, who decide what their budget is, and the mayor must put that amount in the budget. One is the city council. We have public hearings, and then we say our budget should be X, and the mayor must put it into the budget. He usually will give us a knock. We cut our budget this year. We still got a knock. But okay, that's part of politics. The other one is the Campaign Finance Board. The Campaign Finance Board, being an independent body, it was determined that they should decide what their budget is, and when they decide on that budget, this is a charter, this was a voter change on the charter. When they decide what should be in the budget, that's what goes into the budget. Because otherwise, being a political body, if they issue rulings against council members or the mayor, which they did. They issued rulings against Rudy Giuliani. They issued rulings against David Dinkins. There's always that attempt the next year to cut their budget. So they were made immune. And the only other one who has a say in what their amount will be is the relatively new Independent Budget Office, which their budget is mandated by law to be at least 10% of what the Office of Management and Budget is, who prepares the city's budget for the mayor. And their budget must be at least that 10%. I just would want to go into a few minutes, just a few things that we do. I hope it's not giving away like secrets or whatever. But when times are bad, but you still want to have a benefit, you want to get the word out that you care about a topic, there are different things that you do in tough times, and we wanted to add police. But we couldn't always afford to. Now, I'm not talking about the 5,000 Safe Cities, Safe Streets, but in other years, much earlier, when we wanted to add police, how can we add police if we don't have that much money? Well, we make an announcement that we're going to add 1,000 policemen next year. But we decide that we're not going to add them July 1st of next year, where we have to pay the entire year. We announce that we're going to put them in next June 1st, or even June 30th, the last day of the year. So in this year's budget, we can put in pennies, but still the public they feel better because they know that new policemen are on the way. We're hoping that next year the budget will be better, the economy will be better, we'll be able to fund them. And even if we can't, we'll worry about it next year. And lastly, I just want to go over, there's one site at City Hall during budget time which hasn't changed in my 25 years, and that's from when we start actively negotiating the budget till we adopt, is a site of lobbyists and public interest groups at City Hall. These are people who either represent their causes, the causes, or they're hired, and they do not leave City Hall day or night until the last elected official leaves for that day. If the last elected official is there at 3 o'clock in the morning, there are 4, 5, or 6 who will always be there. They're always looking for a sympathetic ear to try and what they're trying to do is get a new program funded. They're trying to save a program that may have been cut. They're trying to get a little extra restoration. And they always have an angle, this is for kids, this is for students, this is for that. And those that have and they're always there, but those that have a worthy cause, often for hanging around, or often somewhat rewarded for their clients.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gary Loman. Okay, now we're going to bring up the present budget director. And one thing that I'm sure they'll find interesting, Larry, is the difference between the tax refund that the mayor wants to make and the tax refund that the city council wants to make. On the one side, the mayor wants to give back the $400 million to the people who paid it. On the other side, the mayor wants to talk about, the council wants to talk about reducing on a permanent basis the real estate tax. So Larry, why don't you come up and explain it? This is Larry and Angelo, the budget director of the city council.
Let's see. I guess to start off the discussion with what's the point of doing a budget and how important is a budget, my finance chair just reminded me that today we did a budget modification where the mayor proposed cutting CUNY by $5.4 million, and the council put that money back. So, just today. That's right.
The timing was perfect, David.
I think the process envisioned by the charter in terms of how the budget was supposed to go is the following. The mayor will start off in January with his preliminary budget. The council will hold hearings, agency by agency, to see what that preliminary budget is about. The council in March will put forward their own proposals for how to change the budget. The mayor will read that, respond to what the council says, incorporate some of them into his executive budget. There's another round of hearings. And then, if you read the charter, basically what should happen is the mayor should deliver a revenue letter telling the council how much in non-property tax revenues is available. The council then should pass an expense budget and then pass a tax fixing resolution that plugs the gap between the total amount of non-property tax revenue available and the total size of the expense budget. So let's say the council wants to pass a $40 billion expense budget. The mayor tells us there's $30 billion in non-property tax revenue, and then the council sets a property tax rate equal to $10 billion. There's a balanced budget, and everybody goes on vacation in July. Of course, that's not exactly how it works. And essentially, if you're having a consensus budget where the mayor and the council come to an agreement, all of those things are negotiated. And they're all negotiated at the same time. The size of the expense budget, the rate for the property tax, and to some extent, the amount of non-property tax revenues in a revenue forecast. And although a forecast is always done scientifically, there's always a margin of error. And so that there's some room for negotiation there. And that's how it goes if it goes smoothly. Below the radar screen, what's actually happening, and Gary talked about having a restoration list and whittling it down. And by the way, Gary is the only person who really knows council procedure in the entire city of New York. So whenever you're trying to figure out how to do something, you ask Gary, and then we think he makes it up because nobody else knows anyway. So, and everybody listens to what he says because he's the only one who knows or purports to know. I mean, basically what the council members do is sit down and decide in the best of all possible worlds, how much they would like to change the expense budget. It's called a restoration list, and as Gary pointed out, for the most part, what ends up happening is a budget is adopted, the council puts money in for its priorities and programs. That funding remains, if we're lucky, throughout the year, or if we fight hard enough. And then the mayor cuts that funding for the following year. So we're always in the mode of putting back what we already put back the year before. And sometimes I feel like my life is like that movie Groundhog Day. You know, where the alarm wakes up and you do the same thing every day and until you get it right. So council members will sit down in a room, and they sit by borough delegations, and, you know, they ask for $1 billion in extra spending. And the mayor says, I don't think $1 billion. And as the negotiations go on, the members will sit there with a restoration list and begin to talk with each other about what their priorities are and begin to lower that restoration list. And the mayor will start to up his offers until we, hopefully, everybody meets and we have a consensus budget. Now, I guess the problem with the new council and the term-limited council was they took office in January 2002. You had a brand-new Speaker of the Council. Though he'd been a council member, he was a brand-new Speaker. You had 38 brand-new council members who really didn't know each other. And they walked into the worst budget crisis in a generation, essentially a $6 billion budget gap. So the budget task for the last 2.5 years for the brand-new council was to find a way to avoid a financial control period, which is when the city cannot balance its budget, basically an appointed body comes in and manages it for us. And if you had asked most people, they would have said this brand new council, and also, by the way, a brand new mayor who'd never been in government before, will not be able to handle this. And there were even some people who said, well, maybe it's better to have a financial control period. You know, we'll just come in, we'll manage it, we'll take the tough decisions. This council could never take those tough decisions, especially because they're so new. And as it turned out, they stepped up to the plate and did what they had to do. They cut the budget, they cut spending by about $3 billion, and they raised taxes by about $3 billion, and they raised the property tax by about 18.5%, which is probably the toughest decision they had to make, and they just stepped up to the plate and they did it, and they all got reelected, which sort of says sometimes good policy is good politics. The budget of the city of New York is $44 billion. Only about $15 billion of that is discretionary, meaning it's not mandated by state or federal regulation. So when you have to find a way to balance a $6 billion gap and you've only got $15 billion to play with, you can understand what a tough job they had. But much to everyone's surprise, including myself, they stepped up to the plate and they just did it. Now, the test they haven't faced, though, is doing their own budget. And knock on wood, hopefully we don't have to do that this year. But, you know, given their track record, I'm sure they'll step up to the plate and do it. The speaker alluded to a moment where you're seeing a very sharp difference of opinion between the speaker and the council and the mayor. The mayor this year decided that although he had asked the council to increase property taxes by 25%, and the council negotiated him down to 18.5%, he's now decided taxes are too high. Property taxes are too high. And what he has proposed to do is go to Albany and get state legislation to give every owner of a 1, 2, or 3 family home or a co-op and a condo essentially a rebate check for $400. Whether that co-op owner paid an increase of $200 or $800, they're all getting that same $400 check. Now, part of the reason the current Speaker of the Council objects so strongly to that is that, in fact, half of the property taxes in this city are paid by businesses. All right, that's where the high value is, the large office buildings in Manhattan. And property taxes in a commercial building essentially are all passed on to the tenants. Most leases have a clause that says that explicitly. So the problem with doing a rebate for homeowners is that the business community will continue to shoulder this burden. And since everyone paid, it did seem to Gifford Miller that everyone should get some benefit. In addition, the city is a city of renters. There are about 2 million renters in New York City. They also would get no relief from this because they rent in, apartment buildings, totally excluded from this tax rebate. The longer-term problem may be is the mayor, when he proposed this, knew how enticing it would be to your average council member. Owners of single-family homes and co-op and condos, property owners, vote in very high rates. You're giving them a bigger tax cut than you would give them if you did a traditional across-the-board tax cut. And it's very good politics and very bad policy. Part of the problem will be if you spend $250 million giving a tax cut to only 22% of the taxpayers, how will you ever give a tax cut to the other 80% of the taxpayers, renters and businesses, and even utilities who also pass on the property tax directly to their customers? So the speaker stood up very strongly in his State of the City speech and said he was having none of this, and just went to Albany yesterday and made it very clear to the state legislature that this was not a tax policy the council supported, and instead he offered a earned income tax credit for low-income workers, a complete rebate of the property tax increase for senior citizens on a fixed income. And then if there's enough money in the budget, the city council will propose to do what the city council should do, which is do an across-the-board cut of 2%. I don't know how this is going to play out, because the mayor seems to feel very strongly about giving a rebate check, probably with his picture on it. And I hope this is not a budget buster. I hope this is something that can be negotiated, but it, in the end, may not be. So there may be some fireworks over the budget this year in June.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. If the mayor were here, or the mayor's representative were here, they would say that the class 1, 2, 3 are the ones who can't recoup their taxes, whereas the multiple dwellings and the businesses and everyone else can recoup the money. And that class has always been the protected class in the city of New York because it's the most vulnerable class in terms of, you have many, many people that might be living in expensive homes, but are living on a fixed income, Social Security, and they just can't afford it. I'm not taking a position on this because technically I'm neutral, even though I'm the former Speaker of the City Council. Those of you who'd like to ask questions, we have a microphone right up there. And I see Steve DiBrienzo coming. Are you asking a question, Steve? No. Okay. Yes, just come right up to the mic, sir. Whoever wants to ask a question, just go right over to the mic. Yes, sir.
My name is Joseph Kuzinski, and I have a question for you. On July 15th, 1999, I sent the check to the New York City Department of Finance. I know a place where you can find some money. The check number is 2041. I'll tell you the amount in a few minutes.
Not a few minutes. You're going to do it in a few seconds.
Okay,
Go
in a
ahead.
few seconds. We have to make this like a radio spot.
Well, if we end in an hour, that's
All right. When I went down 2 months later, because I had want to pay for something regarding a private house, I saw boxes and boxes
Of checks.
laying on the floor, and asked why I didn't receive my check back, and why I didn't get what I asked for.
You're going to get your cancel check back, yeah.
Then if I got the cancel check back and didn't get what I asked for, that would be another problem. This $2 check was never cashed in 1999.
That would have bailed us out. We could have used the money.
I'm telling you. And the other thousands, tens of thousands of checks that were on the floor, in the box, in Brooklyn, in the municipal building, were never opened. up to that point. So figure it out.
No, I think that there was quite a story about that. As fact, if Victor Robles, the city clerk, would tell you he found the same thing that existed in the clerk's office. And the new mayor and the new administration have promised, and I think they have cleared up. I hope you got your canceled check back.
No, I never got the check back.
Well, we'll have to talk to the mayor about that.
Please,
because
it's, excuse me, it's $2?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, son.
I just had a question about the mandate after the state high court decision for adequately funding the city schools. And last I heard, I think it was on one of the public affairs programs, was there's some debate about what that figure might end up being and how that might play out in the budget process. I heard the latest figures, someone correct me if I'm wrong, that Campaign for Fiscal Equity, which brought the suit, said $9 billion. Regents said $6 billion. I think the most conservative one was $4 billion, but that it was still up in the air, and there was a thing about the audit, and I was wondering, how that.
Yeah, what he's alluding to is that there's always been a discriminatory basis of funding between the city of New York and the state of New York. The average child in the city of New York gets $2,500 less in state aid than the average child in the state of New York, and that's outrageous. So a suit was brought 3 or 4 years ago, and the federal court said, yes, you're right, and the state of New York must reimburse the city of New York and must come up with a fairer way of treating children equally. This is a state obligation. So there's a campaign for fiscal equity. As last I heard, and unless you heard different, they're about $1 billion apart. Have you heard anything different? David, do you know how far apart they are?
Well, my understanding is actually
David Weprin, Chairman of Finance, yes.
the Albany is going to be coming up with capital money. It looks like whether it'll be $6.5 billion, which is what the mayor's plan calls for, is probably not going to happen.
But it's supposed to be coming up within the next few weeks, isn't it?
Well, before they do the budget in Albany, which normally hasn't been on time in many years. 20 years.
27 years.
But actually, the 1 year my father was speaker was a day late. So.
That's all Weprin was. All right, son, the answer should be coming, as to my knowledge. It's supposed to be sometime in the month of May. We'll have an answer for you. It's a very good question.
Okay.
Anybody else have any questions whatsoever on the matters that we've been discussing? All right, then let me just make one other thing clear. I've had the privilege of serving with 3 different mayors in the capacity of Speaker of the City of New York. Mayors Koch, Mayors Dinkins, and Mayors Giuliani. And I have always found them to be their number one concern, what is best for the City of New York. And that's that healthy tension that should exist and must exist between the executive branch and the legislative branch. That's the way it's supposed to work in the state level and the federal level and on the City of New York level. And we've been very fortunate to have mayors that worked very closely with the City Council and still do. As you heard from Larry, and even though there are disputes and disagreements, they were placed in a terrible situation, both Mayor Blemberg and the City Council, and they've done a heck of a job under the circumstances. Hopefully, if anything is accomplished by this course, it's that government is a good thing. It's supposed to work with your consent. It's good to be involved in government. This is the greatest city and the greatest country in the world with all the mistakes it makes. But it'll make a lot more mistakes unless good people know that you can have an influence and that you could come into government. I put all of this in writing, and hopefully before my life ends, this will be published. And with the help of a fellow that's sitting here right now, Paul DeAngelis. Raise your hand, Paul. He's the editor of a forthcoming book, which should be talking about this same principles that we've talked about now. And if we can, or anybody can make a difference, this is the time to try. There was a big poster in my City Hall office, and it was of John F. Kennedy, and it was his favorite saying, and it showed him with a sailboat. It said, every man can make a difference, and every man should try. Trust me, every one of you can make a difference. Thank you very, very much. It's really been a pleasure.
Before we leave, let me just do one quick final acknowledgement and then make one closing comment. Final acknowledgement is one of the individuals who make these programs happen is Ernest Rodriguez Nas, standing all the way in the back, who's usually outside, and we never get a chance to thank him. So Ernest, thank you. And let me just make an elaboration on 2 points that were made tonight about making a difference. There was a lot of jest about what goes on in the budget process in the early part, and in the course of it, this comment about $5.4 million restoration to the CUNY budget. To all of the CUNY students and the parents of students who come here, it makes a difference when the city council is supportive of the university and doesn't allow its budget to be cut, because that allows the chancellor of the university to then, when he has to raise tuition, try to keep it as low as possible. If it wasn't as supportive a council as we've had the last few years, the tuition hikes at the university would have probably been higher. And so it does make a difference if you get involved and you support the elections in your community and you register to vote and you get people elected to office who support your values. And I think it is important to acknowledge, because for the last few years, in the worst budget situation, CUNY's budget has been preserved by the council. Every time it's been cut, it's been restored, and that has made a significant difference for us to be able to operate in some of the worst times of the city and still deliver quality education. So I think the point Peter's been making, you've got to do the right thing, and doing the right thing means you've got to extend yourself, and in a sense, it's okay if it's your own special interest. If you want a university that can give you high quality education at a course you can afford, you have to have people who want to be able to support it. So I thank Peter, I thank all of you for attending. There's some brief refreshments behind me, and have a great evening.